without further ado, here is our talk. So this is the GBA Plus framework. So identifying your unconscious bias in design. So yes, just wanted to introduce our speakers. So Jen Cassidy focuses on creating systems that empower, enrich, and celebrate the human condition. She's a senior human-centered design professional with over 20 years working in large, complex organizations, provincial municipal governments, post-secondary institutions. Her work is focused on the design of services and processes, facilitation, design thinking, creative problem solving, and work-based learning for lasting or organizational change. She loves to nerd out on history, hike and camp, and as I was finding out, she currently is learning how to ride dressage, which, as I was mentioning, that's the very first person I've ever met that actually does that, which is super impressive. So that's horse dancing if you've ever watched the Olympics. So I'm sure she'll mention that. Yeah, so without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen and pass that over to Jen.
Well, thanks so much. Appreciate it. And I'm really glad to be here. And it's an absolute honor to be invited to give a talk to this group. And yes, so I am coming to you from Treaty 6 territory. I'm currently located in Edmonton. And again, like Dave, I give thanks for the many traditions and caring for the land that Indigenous people have offered over thousands of years. And as a Métis person myself, I say hey to that. So thank you very much. So yes, horse dancing. If you want to get into that, we can talk about that a bit later on for sure. But thanks for that kind introduction, Dave. And let's jump in. So I'm just gonna turn my just going to turn over to share my screen here. And second, that doesn't work. Let me do that again. There we go. Okay. I'm sure Dave or Evan will interrupt me if they can't hear me. So
perfect. You are ready to go.
Perfect. Great. Yes. So I am Jennifer Cassidy. I work for CGI, and in CGI Western Canada, I'm the Director of Service Design. And so what that really means is I get to hang out with some really great people who do disciplines of all types when it comes to design, UX being one of them, but other types of designers as well. My background is in instructional design, so my graphics aren't fantastic, but boy, I can help you learn. So that's me. So you're right. Dave mentioned that, really when we talk about service design in my team, we're really talking about everything that's for, by, or with humans has an element of design to it, and should have an element of design to it. Thinking about the person that you are trying to enrich or empower or even celebrate is something that I think is an important piece of what it means to be a designer. But as Dave mentioned, we do have a responsibility as designers of all stripes to make sure that what we're designing isn't just enriching, empowering, and celebrating the humans that we're designing for, but also making sure that our own biases, which are perfectly normal, by the way, don't get in the way of that celebration and of that beautiful design that we're working on. And so throughout this next 30 minutes or so, we're going to talk about unconscious bias. And I'm going to provide you some examples of unconscious bias. We're going to do some thought experiments. And then we're going to talk about Gender-Based Analysis Plus, which is a framework that anybody can use to examine their own unconscious bias when it comes to things like design, policy, programming, whatever it might be, and surface those so that we can put those aside, examine them, and make sure that they don't impact our users negatively. So that's what we're going to focus on today. So first thought experiment. Here we go. There's going to be a word on the next screen, and we're going to say this word together 5 times. Now, say it in your mind. You don't have to say it out loud if, you know, people around you can be like, what are you doing? But I want you to think this word 5 times. And then I'm going to ask you a question. And I want you, if you can, to type your answer in the chat. So 5 times we're going to say this word, and then I'll ask you the question, type it in the chat. Type your answer in the chat. Ready? This is the word white. We're going to say it 5 times. White, 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 white. What do cows drink? Type that in the chat. And so now I'm going to have to rely on Evan or Dave to let me know what's going on in the chat there. What kind of answers did we get?
We're seeing milk, we're seeing water. We're seeing pens.
That's a new one. Let's focus on the milk and the water. Cows drink water, but it's very common to have the answer to that question be milk. And the reason for that is unconscious bias. So this is a very, very good example of unconscious bias. You hear the word cow, you hear the word white, and you hear the word milk, and your brain just throws those things in a bucket inside your brain, and then spits out what is kind of the first thing that comes to its mind, to the conscious mind, and often it's milk. It's very common. So if you said water, good for you. Way to go, you got the answer right. If you said milk, thank you very much for being my little guinea pigs and showing what unconscious bias looks like. So at the beginning of the talk, I talked about how we all have unconscious bias. It's perfectly normal. And it is. It's a scientific fact that when you have so much information coming into a channel, for example, like your eyes and your senses and your touch and your ears and all of that kind of stuff, your brain literally cannot process that information as slowly as it might need to in order to make conscious decisions about it. So basically, if you've ever watched that video, the Grinch, when the Grinch Stole Christmas, and Jim Carrey's character, the Grinch, is like throwing mail in the mailboxes in Whoville, and just wherever it goes, it goes. That's what's happening in your brain 99% of the time when you're out in the world walking around. There's so much information coming in that your brain needs to have a shortcut, and so it starts just slotting stuff into buckets. So here is your brain on bias. If you have a brain, you have bias. And that's just a normal way that your brain processes that information. The challenge comes when your cognitive biases get in the way or are not examined well enough to know when they're incorrect. And that takes a lot more time. So it takes time to examine those things and look for biases that your brain may be like, yep, got it. All the mail's in the slot, ready to go. But to really slow down for a moment and think about your biases requires a little bit more time. And that's where GBA Plus comes in as a very useful tool. So a little bit about cognitive bias. So this is a lovely little graphic from a website called Raconteur, and it really gives you a lovely example of some of the biases that you may hold. And most brains do hold this type of bias. And remember, it's just a way of your brain processing so much information. So for example, you've got the anchoring effect. And that's where, you know, we rely too much on our first impressions. So, you know, it worked this way the first time, it's got to work that way again. You've got blind spot bias, for example. So, you know, we think we're less biased than everybody else. So, you know, let's ignore that piece of information because I know that person's biased. But that actually is a form of your own bias. Here's an interesting one. This one is status quo bias. So currently preferring current state of affairs over change. So many folks that you work with or that you encounter on a daily basis may say things like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's actually a form of cognitive bias. And those things are okay. They're what help us actually get through our day without completely freezing up and getting, the blue circle of death that you get on your computer screen, but, happening in your brain. But the GBA plus method, when we're designing and we're being very thoughtful about what we're designing, needs to be, it's where, let me start again. The GBA plus method really gives you that opportunity to really slow down, which is where you need to be as a designer, slowing down and being really thoughtful about what you're designing. So let's go on, and now let's take that cognitive bias idea a little bit further. So we started with something fairly innocuous like milk, cow, and white. Let's look at some other ways that your brain may have bias when we're talking about human beings. So I'm going to show you a series of pictures. And all I want you to do, and again, no judgment here, but all I want you to do in your mind is, what's the first thing you think about when you see this person? What's your impression? So here's the first picture. And just notice, no judgment, just notice where your brain goes when you see this person, if this was your user. How about this one? How about this one? And finally, how about this one? So as human beings and being very visual and taking into account our own backgrounds, our own ways that we grew up, the ways we see the world based on how we were brought into the world and brought up through schooling, through parents, through religion, through friends, through cultures, you will have different cognitive biases about these people. And while it is really normal, because your brain's like, oh, okay, here's a picture, I got to process it. The GBA plus method helps you really slow down and think about your own experiences or your own lenses of how you see the world and how that may impact how you see the people you're designing for. So I'm going to show you another video here. This is a really interesting video, and some of my colleagues that I saw enter the room. Hi, Victor. Hi, Megs. May have seen this video before. This actually comes from the city of Edmonton, where I actually used to work, and they do a really lovely job of infusing gender-based analysis plus into a lot of the work they do. So I know I've talked a lot about GBA plus here, and we're going to talk about the process in a second, but I want to show you this video because I think it's quite lovely. And just for a minute, I'm going to end the slideshow, and then I'm going to turn on the audio so that you can hear that. 2 minutes. Not even 2 minutes.
Imagine a busy street that you know. A place with shops and restaurants. Maybe there's a condo or two, park or school nearby. It's a place that is very familiar. When you look at it, you pay attention to the buildings, the people, and the traffic. But you probably notice less obvious things too. Your favorite restaurant stands out. That new shop seems intriguing. You also see the cracks in the sidewalk that are going to widen after the first freeze. And that business that never shovels after a snowfall, making the sidewalk an icy hazard. You notice these things because of your experience, your knowledge, and your reality. This is your lens. We all have one. Your view of the world is shaped by your life story. The funny thing about lenses is that we often don't know we have them. They are invisible to us because they've always been there. Lenses can be powerful. They can make things instantly visible to you that others might not see without having them pointed out. But different people have different life stories, and therefore different lenses. And different groups of people have common experiences that allow them to see similar concerns. People of different genders, for example, notice things other genders may not see. This is what we mean by gender lens. Gender is an important feature of identity that impacts what we see, notice, and feel when we look at a situation. People of different genders may not see the things that you do, but they will also see things that you don't. Just because we don't see something with our own lens doesn't mean it's not there and that it doesn't affect people. So when someone makes decisions affecting our city, like our mayor, councillors, city employees, planners, and contractors, they need to be able to see things through many lenses. This takes training. We are all experts at seeing things through our own lens, but we're not naturally good at seeing things through others. That's why City of Edmonton employees are now taking Gender-Based Analysis Plus training, or GBA Plus for short. It's a way of making sure that different perspectives are included for good decision-making. It's about training people to add lenses to their collection to make sure our city works for everyone. And that includes the lenses of men, women, non-binary folks, Edmontonians who have different accessibility needs, as well as people from different cultures, ages, and income levels. All these lenses need to be considered too, which is why it's called GBA Plus. The plus refers to other identities, experiences, challenges, and realities. Though GBA Plus training starts with gender, it doesn't end there. It opens the door to viewing our city through many lenses and considering many perspectives. The important thing is, lenses aren't swapped, they are added. We're not trying to replace one point of view with another. We are including them all. The more lenses we add to our analysis of a situation, the more citizens we serve when we solve the problem. Changing your viewpoint from your own lens to multiple lenses can be challenging, and adding lenses can make situations that used to seem simple a whole lot more complex. But it's important to address the complexity. Humans are complex beings, and cities are complex systems. When we oversimplify decisions or prioritize the needs of one group over others, we don't create spaces that work for everyone. And it's also the standard we hold our leaders to. They have a responsibility to represent all Edmontonians, and GBA Plus is how we ensure that they are prepared to do this. So let's look at that street scene again. You may see the cracks in the sidewalk, your favorite restaurant, and that inviting park. Susan might see a lack of bright lighting. Rachel might notice the lighting too, but she also sees that the curbs don't have cutouts. Ahmet might also notice the curbs because they make it harder for him to walk with his daughter in the park. And he also sees the lack of police presence on the street. All these perspectives are valid, but if you only asked one person or group what they see, you wouldn't get the whole story. GBA Plus analysis helps us all to see the big picture and make better decisions for all Edmontonians.
So hopefully that gave you a little bit of an insight into GBA Plus. And really, GBA Plus is a methodology for working through not just the personalities or the profiles of the people that you're designing for. Oh, good. I'm glad you liked it, Erica. But it also is a way of helping us understand how we see the world. And I'll give you an example. And again, this is an example from when my time as I was a lead for GBA Plus for an organization, and we were working together to understand how to redesign a neighborhood. So this was a neighborhood in Edmonton that had, probably about good 50, 60 years of history. And it was slowly changing over time. And not only were the demographics changing, but also the infrastructure was aging. And so I was sitting with this group and I said, okay, so let's talk about, let's talk about this design. That you're bringing forward. And we had a whole bunch of great people. We had architects and we had planners and we had project managers, and they were all really keen to see this neighborhood be revitalized. And so they started asking me about how they might do GBA Plus when it comes to their design for this neighborhood, and so they were throwing out ideas about what they could do to make it more accessible or this or that. And I said, just a minute, let's actually start back with the team. So I want you all to take a minute, and I said this to the group around the table, I want you to just take a minute and I want you to think about yourselves. So tell me a little bit about who you are. And so I got some introductions and things like that. And I said, okay, now holding that in mind, holding your own lens in mind, let's talk about the neighborhood that you're redesigning or you're refreshing. And slowly, as we talked about their life stories or their experiences, and we talked about the neighborhood themselves, they realized that they had some blind spots. And a big one that sort of jumped out for them was they said, well, we're all professionals. We're all mid-career professionals. We all own homes. We all drive cars. And for the most part, we all have, pets and families and partners and all of that kind of stuff. And I said, so now tell me about the neighborhood. And they said, well, this is a neighborhood for people that are going to university. A lot of university people, students live in this neighborhood. Oh, okay. So what do we know about them? Well, for the most part, they might not own a home. They might be away from home for the first time and living in a rental or living on campus. And so what they realized was that they really had to start thinking about what their biases are on what people would need in that neighborhood. So they were talking about widening the streets and making it, a bit more car friendly so that, there were these sharp turns or whatever it was. And then what they realized was that, they probably were looking at this from the lens of being a homeowner, being usually not living in the city center or not living in a high density neighborhood, and they really started to have to rethink that. So that's an example of where, when we talk about gender-based analysis plus, and we'll talk a little bit about the history of why it's called GBA plus in a second, the additional lenses, rather than looking through your own lens or switching out a lens and putting in a new lens, is really the richest way to look at things. Because in the end, they realize that they're not just men and women, they're not just sons and daughters, they're not just mums and dads, they're not just workers and non-workers, they're all of these things together combined, and that's what makes them human. And so when they're designing for their for that neighborhood, they really had to think about how they saw the world and whether or not that was going to be the way the people that they were designing for saw the world. So that being said, let's talk a little bit about GBA plus. So gender-based analysis plus really started quite a while ago in the 70s in the government of Canada, and it came about from policy. So in writing policy, there were a number of incidents in the 70s and 80s where policy would get written from the federal government. They'd send it out and they're like, look at our fantastic policy, it's going to make everybody happy, everybody's going to be doing really well, particularly in policies and procedures around healthcare. What they realized was that a number of times the policies or the procedures that were being endorsed by the government were actually failing women in particular. And that's why it's started to be called gender-based analysis. Because, for example, the way women experience heart attacks is not the way men experience heart attacks. And they couldn't figure out for a long time why heart attack patients who were female were not being caught in the emergency room when they first presented with these symptoms. And it was because the policy had been written from the perspective of how men experience heart attacks. The plus really comes from that idea that we are more than just our gender. We are more than just our race. We are more than just our socioeconomic status. We're more than just our culture. We're all of these things together. And that's what makes us so wonderfully complex as human beings. So here it is in a kind of a nutshell. There's two parts to gender-based analysis, and we'll talk a little. This might look overwhelming at first, but we'll talk a little bit about this afterwards. Gender-based analysis plus will always start with you. It always starts with the designer. It always starts with the person who is preparing to send something out in the world for humans to use. And it's a circular process. So there's really no end and no beginning to this, because as you learn more, you surface more, you fix more, you improve more, you learn more, you have more assumptions. And so I want to be really clear here that this isn't a start to finish. This isn't a checkbox. This is a journey. This is a journey that you'll go on as a designer. It's a journey that your product will go on. And it's a journey, as you can see in the example from the city of Edmonton, it's a journey that cities and city workers go on. So the first part of the process is really about trying to identify that issue. So what are we talking about here? And in the case of my colleagues who were designing a new neighborhood, it was about, well, we're designing a neighborhood that is aging and the demographics are changing. Okay, now let's talk about our assumptions. So what are we assuming about the people we're designing for? And again, if you've done UX and you're really practiced in those principles, you'll know that empathy is kind of that first step, and you really want to talk about your user profile. You really want to understand the user. But added to that, gender-based analysis plus asks you to challenge your own assumptions about them as well. And that can have a lot to do with where you sit in relation to power and where you sit in relation to privilege. And we'll talk about that in a second. Once we have our own assumptions on the table, like those designers who were like, yeah, we all own houses and we're designing for people who typically are going to be university students. That's an assumption that I'd make that I need to surface and be aware of when I'm designing. Then comes research and consultation. And so again, very much like practices of UX that you're all very familiar with, GBA Plus really asks you to try to understand the world of the person you're designing for. And in some cases, you'll want to, you can go on StatsCan and say, okay, I'm designing, I'm designing for this population group. Let's try and understand, who they are from census data, for example. You may consult with them, or you may consult with a subset of people. There are some protocols around that. So again, if you're doing a lot of consultation with communities that have typically been very far away from the center of power, you just want to be really careful that you're not taking from them in terms of research and then never giving anything back. So, particularly in Indigenous communities, we want to be really, really sensitive to that. Once you have an idea of your own bias and your own lens, and you're starting to understand the lenses of others, you can start to develop some options. And so how might we becomes a really good beginning phrase for any type of discussion on how we might mitigate our own biases and really make sure that not only what we're designing is great for our user, but it doesn't accidentally cause harm. Because we haven't thought about those lenses, very similar to the example of the heart attack between men and women that I explained previously. So let's look at this wheel of power and privilege. This is a lovely little tool that I like to use. And so the wheel of power and privilege, you can find lots of examples online, but basically what it does is it takes all those lovely lenses that you saw examples of in the video and allows you to look at your own experience and that of the people that you might be designing for. So the further we get away from the center of the wheel, the more marginalized the people that you have that you're designing for are. And so, of course, we know that power and privilege comes along with a sense of control and a sense of being kind of the way things are. But that we know that that's not true. Once we stop and think about it, we know that's not true, and that's overcoming our cognitive bias. And we're all parts of these. We're all little bits of all of these things. So, for example, you might have somebody who is, let's say, slim, right? Which typically is associated with being closer to the center of power. And so they're closer to the center of power there. But let's say that they're undocumented migrants. That brings them further out from that center of power and they become marginalized. So being really mindful of where your users are sitting potentially in the wheel of power and privilege and where you sit in the wheel of power and privilege can be really illuminating that way. So that really is the first step. Let's identify the issue. Let's challenge our assumptions. Let's research, consult, learn about the lenses of others, and then let's develop some options for whatever it is we're designing. Next, the second part of this comes into play, and this is where you take action. So again, here, once you have some options, you'll want to implement some options. Let's try some things. So for example, I'm putting a park bench into a park that I know is surrounded by folks that live in assisted living. So I'm going to want to design for a person who may have mobility issues. In my mind, I think we'll make it a lower bench so that people don't have to climb up if they have problems. Or I want to make it a higher bench so that people can sit more easily. And part of that will be informed by my research. And I'll try it. And then I'll watch for a few days and see how it goes. Oh yeah, I can see some folks there have mobility issues. Yeah, they really seem to be finding that higher park bench helpful. Great, I'm gonna document that and say, you know, typically what I found is that people have mobility issues in this area tend to like the higher park bench, for example, and then communicate that, right? And make sure that you're leaving a record behind in terms of the biases that you held, or the lenses that you held, the lenses that you explored, and some of the ways that you might make that design better. And we're going to talk a little bit about this in a second, but I just want to pause here because this is a bit of a complex graphic. And I'll just ask Evan or Dave, if you have questions there, I can stop for a second and answer those before we move on.
No questions.
I don't see any questions in the chat.
Okay, so there are probably questions in your mind, and one of them is, well, what if I've got very little budget? What if I don't have a lot of people or time to do this? Or what if what I discover in terms of making a design really useful after I've practiced GBA Plus is so big, it's like a giant inflatable turkey walking down the street? There are options. So GBA Plus really does not ask you to be the be all and end all. The only thing you need to start practicing gender-based analysis plus and focusing on that wheel of power and privilege is the will. And so if you have tons of money all the time in the world and people, fill your boots. You can research to the nth degree. You can really get detailed with your solutions. You can really start to leave behind some better, some good recommendations. You can spend all the budget you have on accessibility for whatever it is you're designing, or to reduce the impacts of power and privilege on marginalized people. Sure, that's great, but that's really rare. And so all GBA Plus asks you to do, and all I ask you to do, is just try. Just start with what you have. And so I'll give you an example. I was working in a project where I was designing a learning program for folks. And so, you know, keeping in mind my design principles and the content, I put something together, and then we practiced GBA Plus. So we actually had a student working with us who I said, okay, let's talk about GBA Plus. We did some lovely training, and I'll give you some resources for that afterwards. And off she went. And in the space of a few days, she'd interviewed some people that were users. She thought about her own biases in terms of how she sees, you know, the function of workplace education, the culture that she came from, and how it sees learning at work, all of that kind of stuff. And for about the price of about 3 or 4 hours worth of her time, she was able to get some really valuable insights to bring back to our project. And as a result of that project, we picked up 3 of the recommendations because we had the time and the money and the ability to do it. And 3 of the recommendations just weren't feasible at the moment. But like I said, I documented what I did and the changes we made, but I also left behind a record of other ways that people who came after me could continue to improve from a gender-based analysis plus lens. And so I always say, when we're practicing gender-based analysis plus, eat that elephant one bite at a time. Any anytime you can examine your own unconscious bias, understand your own lenses of where you come from in terms of your experiences in your life, and the way you see the world, and then think about the way somebody else may see the world, particularly if they are experiencing marginalization in any one of those categories around the wheel of power and privilege, is a good day. And so it's better to do some understanding than turn a blind eye and say, you know, it's just so overwhelming. I can't boil the ocean. Just pick up a glass of that ocean and pick away at it and boil that and leave something behind, so that the next person who has some capacity to keep boiling the ocean can pick it up and say, oh yeah, this is great. We can improve this because now we have a little bit more money, a little bit more people, a little bit more time. So here's the general sort of gist of things. Identify the issues that you're working on. What's the key? Challenge assumptions that you have about the user by looking into yourself and examining your own unconscious bias. Research, consult, add some lenses. Remember, we're never just switching lenses, we're adding lenses. Develop some options. Think about ways that you could improve your design. Implement what you can. Evaluate it. Document what you find, and leave something behind for the next person if you can't take care of all of the recommendations at once. So let's try this. This is a fun little thing. I love this little app. So we're going to pick up a UX issue now. So this is a little website called fakeclients.com. So if you're ever looking for a brief or something to work on, fakeclients.com, when you click on it, it takes you to this lovely little website, which I'll just pull up on my screen here. Hopefully you can see it now. And I click UX design, and I'm going to generate a brief. So here it is, generate brief. So here's our designerly challenge. Angela needs a UX designer for a project that she's working on. She wants to have a design to quickly and easily create a good outfit of clothes in somebody's wardrobe. Can you help her out? So I'm going to go back to my screen here of the GBA Plus process, and keeping in mind that Angela wants to quickly and easily create a good outfit app, I want you to think about what some of those challenges might be. I'm just going to go back here real quick. I'll pull up the wheel of power and privilege so you can take a look. So some things that come to my mind when I'm thinking about an app that can quickly and easily help somebody pick a wardrobe is, you know, if I look at my location on this wheel of power and privilege, you know, I'm able-bodied, I'm neurotypical, I speak English, I have some post-secondary, I own property, and so, you know, in some ways, I'm quite close to the center of the wheel of power and privilege. But what if the person I'm designing for has neurodiversity? How does that change how they may need to, or want to, or desire to access this tool? What if they have significant disability? Clothes themselves become a challenge and a place of power and privilege for people whose bodies don't typically fit regular clothing, or clothing made for people who are significantly able-bodied. What about language? So what if we are designing for somebody who is monolingual and doesn't speak English? How are we going to design that app for them? And it's not always about giving everybody everything that they need. But a lot of times when we're designing, it's about mitigating the negative impact on somebody because of your design. So for example, in the example of the heart health, the design of the policy was fantastic. It was clear, the procedures, it was clear, it was well communicated, there was lots of graphics, it was easy for the doctors to understand, but we didn't think about women. And that significantly negatively impact health outcomes for women. So just a little thought exercise there for you. So some resources for you, GBA Plus, Gender-Based Analysis Plus through the Government of Canada, Women Gender Equality Canada. You can actually take a certification online. It's free. I encourage you to do that. Statistics Canada is a great resource. So if you're looking to find out a little bit more about target populations, but you don't have direct access to those populations, or in some cases it's maybe not appropriate to go straight out to the user, you could take a look at Stats Canada. Diversity Canada Foundation has some great resources in it about working to improve the understanding of diversity and how to work within a highly diverse culture. The Canadian Centre for Diversity Inclusion has some great resources as well. The University of Toronto has some interesting stuff, as does the University of Guelph. And then finally in the middle is the book that I'm currently reading, which is by Jeremy Rifkin. It's called The Empathic Civilization, and it's really about that next stage that Jeremy Rifkin says is the next stage of human evolution, is where we actually really embrace that empathetic piece of our humanity, and it starts to drive policy, design, cities, societies in general. So that's a few great resources, and Dave will send you those links shortly. And so that's me, and that's CGI, and really proud to be here representing both. So I'll stop sharing, and then we'll open it up to questions.
And Max, in its ultimate wisdom, I was trying to unmute myself, and then it shifted over my taskbar right where I was about to unmute. So I was having a little trouble, but thank you so much, Jen. That was really great.
Yeah, and oh, good. I'm glad. And I can see a chat here from Sanchari that yes, you absolutely did a fantastic job in this city on that video. And it's actually one of my absolute favorites. So a big thank you for that. It was very well done. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we have a
yes,
good amount of time for questions. So if anyone has some questions, feel free to type it in the chat. You can use the raise hand feature, and then yeah, we can go from there.
Yeah. And I can see a note here from Deborah McKenzie. You are incredibly correct. That is very similar to the double diamond methodology. And you'll see GBA plus processes represented in a number of different ways. I like to use the double diamond because I think it fits really nice with that approach to design in general. So yeah, if it seems similar, then it is. It's because it is. Oh, Megs, go ahead. I can see your hand up.
Hi, Jen. Thanks so much for presenting. I was really looking forward to your session today. I work with Jen actually from CGI as well, but it's super cool listening to it because we've yet to implement a lot of that GBA Plus framework into some of the processes that we do, at least in the work that I do. So I had a question for you around, you've been employing that framework throughout a lot of your work. And what would you say would be a very impactful example where you've been able to apply that framework and you saw some very, again, impactful results on the user group that you were working with? Like, is there an example where you're just like your heartstrings, like, yes, this is why we do this, or anything along those lines? Or if that's too hard to pinpoint, maybe just a recent example that you have done this beyond the city of Edmonton, beyond the video you showed.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So as I said at the beginning, my design discipline is really in education and being human centered and being putting the human at the center of design when you're learning is of course a foundational piece of it. One example that I can give you is as I was working on a learning design for a group, and as I was creating some online content. I was thinking about my comfort level with this particular medium that I was designing in, and I was thinking about my ability to hear and read and speak and type and do all of those things. And so as I was starting to design, I realized that I had to do some thinking about where I was sitting on the wheel of power and privilege in relation to the people I was designing for. So, I'm post-secondary educated, I'm able-bodied, I have a good understanding of technology, I'm comfortable with technology, but I was actually designing for folks that typically were not necessarily exposed to a lot of complex technology, who may be working in the field, and so they don't typically use software very often, although they would have to actually use this. And so when I started to design, I was very careful to think about the accessibility options there. And so knowing that the people I was designing for may have workplace injuries or whatever it might be, I made sure that I had all of my accessibility options turned on. I made sure that I was not privileging my ability to kind of cut through visual jargon, because not everybody can do that when they're looking at online learning. And I really worked hard to make it very, very clean and very, very simple for that reason, because I was dealing with people who were new to the technology, who may not be, university educated. So let's make sure it's very simple for them to understand, and let's also make sure that we go slow enough and we show enough repetition that it becomes easy for them to pick it up. And again, I say university educated, but that doesn't mean a darn thing. I have some very expensive pieces of paper is all that means. But what it does mean is that I might be exposed to language that others may not have been exposed to. So really trying to make sure that the language was the language of the users. So that was an example. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
Awesome.
Yeah. I can see a question here about, yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I was just going to say there's a question from Michael. Did you want to unmute yourself and ask directly? If not, I can ask on your behalf.
Hello, David. It's fine. You ask on my behalf.
Hi. Yeah. Okay. So the question from Michael here is, what's the relationship between GBA and human-computer interaction? I'm interested in HCI research. Yeah, it's a very, very good question. And what I think you've really identified here is that HCI and GBA Plus are basically coming to the same center point from different perspectives, right? So human-computer interaction, very, very much focused on that accessibility piece, and coming from that experience of working in a virtual environment or with technology. GBA Plus came to the same conclusion, but they came through it originally by policy, through government policy. So very similar. If you're a fan of HCI research and you're very focused on human-computer interaction and the standards related to that, GBA Plus will be a lovely little tool in your tool belt for that. Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
And I can see another question. Yeah, I can see these questions, so I'll dive in there, Dave. Deborah asks, where and how in your process have you most applied the wheel of power? It sounds like you've applied it as part of identifying biases at the beginning, but also in considering design options. Absolutely, you're entirely correct. So the example I gave you of the neighborhood designers, definitely, we really wanted to work through that at the beginning, but I think that wheel of power and privilege is really helpful at all stages of the design, and I'll give give you another example. When we're designing, let's say, virtual spaces, for example, or we're designing in real life spaces, we want to step back a little bit, just like a painter does. You know, a painter gets right in there and does some detail, and then they step back and they look at the overall effect. So when we're designing, as we design, there's a really good opportunity, you know, let's say every time you create a piece, just to kind of step back a little bit and survey it, and then pick up some of those lenses and say, okay, how is this gonna, you know, how is this gonna play out if I have a marginalization factor? And so, you know, while we focus a lot on the user themselves and the job that needs to get done, sometimes it helps to step back and say, what if this, or what if the user has this type of quality? So yeah, I completely agree. Yeah. Yeah, Suha is asking, curious how GBA Plus overlaps with cross-cultural design. That's a great question, and I can give you a bit of my perspective. But again, cross-cultural design for me is one that I haven't dove into probably as much from a theoretical perspective. So I'll give you my my initial thoughts here, and then, you know, it's a great research question. How does it overlap? From my perspective, you know, I think a couple things. So I think one, anytime that we can understand how other cultures design, because it is different, it can be helpful. So having those lenses on how other cultures see the practice of design can really help you bring out your own cognitive biases, and also can help you step into that world of GBA Plus and that world of analysis a little bit easier. So I see an overlap, and I see them quite complementary. Whereas GBA Plus it's not step A, B, C. It's very circular. It is a lovely framework to kind of get some rigor there. Whereas in my mind, when we're practicing cross-cultural design, we're trying to really live that designerly mind. And so one is in my mind maybe a little more sensing and feeling, whereas GBA Plus really asks you to be a little bit more thinking and responding. So yeah. And question from Dave. Curious how you consider GBA Plus when recruiting individuals for user research interviews. Yeah, especially in cases where budgets are small and a limited number of people we can interview. Absolutely. And so I think that this is where I always say, you know, really eat the elephant one bite at a time, and draw on other resources. So as a GBA Plus practitioner, I might use user research interviews, and certainly if I was doing a big piece of UX, I would absolutely go and find those users wherever I could. But there's a great deal of both academic and non-academic research that you could draw on if you can't include all the lenses that you can see. So, you know, there's a number of places, especially University of Toronto and the University of Guelph that I mentioned, that do a lot of that type of diversity research. So dig in there, right, and see what's there. Cruise around to websites or other digital spaces that you know maybe are frequented by people who maybe have a lens that you don't have, for example. So, you know, go and see what it's like to hang out on social media frequented by people who are hearing impaired, for example, and learn a little bit about that. There's a fine line though between creeping and ethnographic research. So again, that you really have to use your discernment there. But yeah, there's absolutely space for all of that, and I think that there's both non-academic and academic research out there that can be really helpful. When I worked for the city, we kept a repository, a little library of research in diversity around architecture, and architects could just go in and like kind of nerd around. Yeah. 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 So that's, and I can see, Evan, you've got to take off. Thanks for coming. Really appreciate that.
Any other questions for Jen? Going once, going twice.
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad that you found this helpful. I'd be super happy to chat anytime about GBA Plus. Thank you so much for coming. I hope that I've given you something to think about. Remember, you don't have to be an expert in GBA Plus. You don't have to do GBA Plus to the nth degree. You just got to start somewhere. And I hope some of the resources that we'll be able to send out to you are very helpful. And email me anytime. My email is just jennifer.cassidy@cgi.com, and I'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jen. And hearing some really, really great love for the talk in the chat. So that is awesome to see. Amazing. Well, hopefully it's sunny up there in Edmonton for you. But yeah, thanks everyone for joining.
It is now, finally.
Perfect.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great
Awesome.
night.
Thank you. All right, take care.